Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining in. Welcome to this Tuesday night live portrait painting demo. And I will just get started here in a second. Hopefully, a couple more people will join, but let's get this show moving. So, tonight I'll be drawing this image that I got off of Sketchy. This is um, Totu. He might be tuning in too, so if he wants to chime in, let me know how to pronounce his name or if that is the name that he goes by. Anyway, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. There's lots of detail in his face. There's also the stubble, which, if you think about it, is a few different things going on. There's the skin tones, the light hitting on both his hair and the skin, and then seeing the skin through that. He has he's lit from the left side of his face, or I should say, our left side, and the half of his face is in shadow, but then has a very fairly strong reflective light coming into that side, and that reflective light is coming in at a sort of a lower angle because you can see it is lighting up the lower edge of his nose and his underside of his brow here and along the ear. So it's actually because it's a fairly strong reflected light. Part of the challenge is to keep those reflected lights dark enough so that it doesn't compete with the light side of his face. There's also his hair is either wet or greasy, and so it's interesting. But there's these fine strands that coming down with these hits of light, and that also will be a bit of a challenge. And then if you look down on his shirt, it is a white shirt, but it's picking up the coolness the of the light source here, and as it goes off into shadow, there, um, this is a cool light source in a warm shadow situation. So that part will be a little bit interesting. So I will go ahead and start the measuring and get this painting started. Okay, I think I'm gonna start off with one. I have a kind of a beat up brush here. It's sort of small, but it's good for doing a little bit of drawing with the paint. And I'm just going to mix a little bit of something like a light purple-ish color to start with. It almost doesn't matter for me what color I start doing the drawing with. It's because all of that will end up getting painted over at some point. So what's important is getting doing quite a bit of measuring, getting the measurements right. So the point already am a little bit off here. Let's see. Actually, pretty close there to the location of his ear. The eyes are going across here, and then his other ear on the other side. We'll get that measurement here too. Tip of his ear is right about there. The lobe of his ear comes in. That actually looks like it's pretty straight across. This lobe maybe just a little bit higher than the other one. I see Lady, hello, welcome. And Angela's here from, she's a coworker of mine, but she likes to keep me company as I do this. And she also tells me if the sound sounds okay. And I know one of the problems that I have is that the microphone on my phone does not get the sound very loud. So I have to be very conscious to be close to the phone and get a fair amount of volume in my speech. I can hear that I'm already a little bit hoarse tonight, and so that's going to be a bit of a challenge as I go through. I did a, I um, what do I call it? I re-recorded, not re-recorded, but reproduced one of my videos, enhanced it, I say, and reposted it to YouTube with the with the volume cleaned up a little bit, where the sound cleaned up so that it was easier to hear. Also, I added some video compression, which is to basically say that all of the sound was brought to a similar level across the whole video, so that I didn't have parts that were dropping off as much. But as I'm moving around and painting, it's a little hard to be focused on where I am in relationship to my phone. Okay, just trying to make sure I'm getting the measurements right. He has a little bit of turn to his nose, and his face, he isn't exactly looking straight at I mean, he may be looking straight at us, but his face isn't exactly centered to us. He has a little bit more of this side of his face showing and a little bit less of this side. So I want to make sure that I also capture that, to make sure that that's not going to throw my measurements off too much. Okay, this and I'm painting him pretty close to life size. He may be just maybe a few percentage points over, without having someone here that I can actually measure their features. It's a little hard to judge what's life size. Also, typically in a selfie, there's going to be a fair amount of distortion in the um, in the proportions, because things in the center of the face will be larger compared to things that are further to the side, just because of the distortion from the camera lens. That's one aspect that I like about a selfie, because even though it is kind of distorted from what you would naturally see, or how a traditional portrait painting is set up, the distortion does make you feel like you're closer to the subject. It has that, giving you information that makes your brain think that it's a little bit, that you're at a closer range, and that it's a more intimate setup. Okay, I'm going to take maybe a little bit more time in the drawing tonight. I will just sometimes go straight into the painting with just very little drawing, but then I have to do quite a bit of adjusting as I go along. There's so much going on in his face with the light and shadow, that I think maybe it's better to not have to adjust so much. And let's just get the top of that shadow. I don't have to know where that eye is exactly, because it's really hard to see where the edges are of it, but I do want to know where that shadow is. So I can pretty much get a pretty good idea of line between the shadow and the light side of the face. So it's something like this. I'm just going to start to come in just a little bit darker as I get a feel for where I am. So all I'm doing is I'm creating a separation, in a sense, between the shadow of his face and the light side. Do want to do a little bit of measuring of where the top of his lip is. And you can see there's very little of the upper lip that you see, almost where that tip of his upper lip is almost the exact same measurement as the separation in his lips. So that's actually right here. So I may have to measure the bottom of his nose again. It looks like I may not have made it low enough. The tip of his nose, rather. Yeah, so I need to come down just a little bit lower with that. Something like this. I'm just going to add a little bit of color just to really make sure I know where the tip of his nose is. Great. So this line is a little more defined. Even though I'm making some pretty strong lines, some of those lines will end up being painted over and disappear. There's some places in a face when you're painting it that you'll see where there's some fairly strong definition or change of color and value between one spot and another, but it isn't always a hard line. Sometimes it's just a more definite one area of color against another, and even if it's a darker area against a lighter area, it's not always as hard a line or as crisp a line as you initially would draw it. So I have to be careful not to make some of those things so pronounced. Sometimes there's a lot of subtlety that's going on, and if you really want to get the right quality, sort of a how would I put it, sort of a visual quality to the face, or a photographic quality, you or realistic quality, then you have to soften up some of and those changes and make them much more subtle. Okay. So he has a couple things going on in his nose. Here's the separation between the light and the dark running down the side of his nose here, and where this turns helps give definition to his nose. It actually then has somewhat of a line just before the base of his nose here. And this is really the core shadow, which is the shadow where it's darkest on a form, because it's not getting light from the primary or key light source, nor is it getting light from the reflected or secondary light source. So if you look on this side of his nose, there's almost no value or color change between his upper lip and the flare of his nostril. There's just a little bit of darkness. It's the inside of the nostril, but it's just so faint. And so when I go to paint this eventually, this will just almost be one solid color there with that one little detail showing. And that just in the right place, it should help describe the change in direction of those forms there. Otherwise, it won't look like he's missing half of his nose if I don't do it right. Okay, and the character of his upper lip is that it's a little bit lower in the middle and then it comes up on the sides. You almost think of it as a bird in flight or something like that. Sometimes I like to try to see the shape of something. If I can kind of think of it as a specific thing, then it helps me with the drawing of it a little bit more. Almost if I'm actually in a way trying to abstract some of the things that I'm seeing so that I don't fall into making it sort of the preconceived notion of what it is. And now I'm starting to come in with a little bit more sort of washy paint so that I can establish a thin layer of paint on the surface of the painting that I can go and then paint into more. And so this is the beginning of the alla prima part of the painting, which is wet into wet, but I need to get some wet down first to paint into it. And this allows me to create sort of subtleties when I paint one color into another. There tends to be a little bit of an averaging of the color. In a way, I'm kind of color mixing right on the photo itself, color mixing right on the panel itself rather. And so unless I put some really thick paint down on top of the thinner paint, that the thicker paint will kind of dominate that as I paint, the color that I'm putting down will tend to mix with the color that's already down on the panel. Feel free to ask questions as I'm painting. I'm more than happy uh, to talk about whatever it is that you want to know about. If it's directly related to what I'm doing on the painting, or you want to know about my materials, or my personal history, or anything else, um, just feel free to go ahead and ask. Okay, I can already see I've made indications where this brow is, but I already can see that I don't have it quite as severe as it actually is. Um, there's um, a lot of pressure, tension right here in the brow itself, and then just like the Himalayas got pushed up by two continents forcing itself together, pushing the the plates or the area between the plates up. This is the same thing right here. The tension between his eyebrows being pushed together um, creates a sort of a sense of tension there. And let me roll this photo down a little bit so I can see where things are. So, lady asked, what colors am I using? I use predominantly um, Gamblin artist colors. Artist is the grade of the color that I'm using. Um, Gamblin also makes 1980, which is a student grade grouping of colors. And depending on where you are in your learning journey, which makes more sense for you to use. Um, I mean, similar to other brands, will have a student grade and a artist grade group of colors. And typically, the artist grade is much more intense color. It doesn't have the kind of fillers that you would find in a student grade paint. Usually, there's fillers to give the paint more body, and those fillers, in a way, decrease from the intensity of the color range or the color in a particular tube. Um, that for me, I want to be able to have access to the highest level intensity possible to be able to get some fairly intense colors where I want them, or to have a very high tinting strength, which is extremely important to me. And tinting strength is colors that hold on to their intensity even when you're adding a lot of white to the color. And so that allows you to have sort of those high key or pastel tones that still have a lot of color in them. And and also in those Gamblin artist grade colors, the colors that I choose tend to be colors, like I said, that have extremely high tinting strength. And I especially like ones that have a high level of transparency so that I could also use them for my shadow side, getting lots of color in the shadows by painting with those colors transparently. And in some cases, mixing with black to either darken colors or to um, knock a little bit of the intensity out of the color. Again, these colors are also, because of their high tinting strength, will also hold on to quite a bit of color even when mixed with black. And again, that's another important aspect for me. So I already have quite a bit um, of information or marked out where things are in the shadow side, so I can start painting my darks, I'm going to paint fairly transparently. I'm going to try to keep it pretty clean, meaning I'm not going to try to avoid getting whites in my darks because that will prevent me from getting as dark as I want in those shadows. And it's just fairly washy right now. I'm just trying to establish again the separation between the lights and the darks. And I am getting a little bit of color, some whites and some opaque colors mixed in there, but not so much that I um, can't overcome that if I need to. So this is where I have to start thinking about the reflected light, which is I see some oranges in there, but that's more the local color. I think the reflected light also looks kind of violet in color. I'm still trying to figure that one out. So I'm just going to add a little bit of my quinacridone red, my purple, um, uh, purple dioxazine purple, which is a very strong color. So um, don't need a lot of it to get the color that I want. So to get this reflected light to read here, and it's probably pretty close to the right value, except for maybe in a spot or two, I really need the area next to it to go much darker. And I want this to be fairly dramatic, so I have no problem going to straight black here to get the as dark a value as I want, or as I feel like I need to really get. See now, see how this area of reflected light is starting to look lighter now that I've surrounded it with almost pure black. And then I have the shoulder coming down here, so I want to make sure paying attention to where that is. Okay, so again, I'm going to start putting down some of my blacks. This is, it's fairly hard to judge values, judge the lightness and darkness of the colors until I have some of my darkest darks in, especially if it's surrounded by black. Really want to get some of that black in and down so that I know. So I can see right here, I'm way too light in here, even though I didn't notice it at first. As I look over here, it is a few steps darker, and that's because I've laid some of this black down so I can start to see that it's not quite dark enough. And this black is actually starting to feel a little bit too warm. So I'm going to throw a little bit of green and purple into that black just so that it has the right amount of coolness to it. I may have overcompensated a little, but that's okay. It's not a crime to have a little more extra color in the dark parts of your painting. So I do what I was going to say about color, like for students who are just learning. It's sometimes it's hard to control the intensity of the color, and then it's hard then to get the painting to harmonize because you've gone too intense or or use the color almost straight out of the tube without really mixing it in a way to knock some of the color out of it. And so if you're using a student grade paint, it's a little bit easier to harmonize the color because the paints aren't going to be quite as rich out of the tube, and they start to lose their value a little more quickly, their intensity, their saturation a little more quickly when you're painting with them. And for a student, that means that it's a little bit easier to control the intensity of the colors. For someone who's an advanced painter that knows they want certain intensity in certain places and are able to control their colors nicely, then that that artist grade paint really is really much more helpful in a way for that level of artist. So it's really depends on what you're trying to achieve, and not to mention for those students that having the student grade paint as a way of limiting your color intensity. Also, that student grade paint is also far cheaper, and so as an added benefit that you're not spending as much for those colors. It is, as a student, if you find you have a project, you have a painting you want to work on, where there's an article of clothing that has a really intense color, or some other reason why you want more intensity in those colors, then you might buy a tube or two of that color, and then you have it on hand for later on when you do decide to shift more into artist grade color palette. So I just want to get a little bit of sense of that reflected light. I keep on saying reflected light of the highlight here in the forehead. It in this case it is kind of bluish or purplish. So I just want to get a little bit of like ultramarine or something in there. And that's going to be one of my lightest lights, but I don't want it so light that I don't see any color in it. So I'm going to just try by putting down some blue there, um, titanium white mixed with a little ultramarine blue. And then I know I have to go a little bit darker around it to get uh, that light to read properly. And the areas around it kind of reddish, a little bit warmer. So I'm going to be shifting from the cool of that direct light to a little bit warmer colors around it. So this is the part of the painting that's all about um, relativeness. So it's just small shifts of moving from warm to cool, or moving from light to dark, and in a way that is as subtle as the reference. It's really easy to sort of hyper focus on the area that you're painting, and then because you're hyper focused on it, you'll tend to exaggerate the color and value differences. And the real trick is to look back then at your resource and to see, well, is it more subtle than what I've painted it? And sometimes you need that subtlety to get other pieces of the painting to work. And this here is an example is how different is the light part of the ear compared to the darker parts of the ear. So I also want to start to get the character of the intensity of his gaze, and which is requiring just get that very tight relationship between the eyebrow and the upper lid of his eye. There's very little difference physically between um, where those are distance wise. We already have a little bit of blue mixed up from that highlight there that I can use in the whites of the eye. And those whites are actually fairly dark in value. So I want to make sure that I push it dark enough. Just a little bit of intense red, or towards the intensity. And then I want to get on the far side of that white of his eyes. I want to make sure that I have that sort of grayish blue that's coming in there. There's no white in there. There actually is, sorry, there's a touch of highlight right in the very corner there, but other than that, there's not the there's not the white that your brain wants to make something that it knows it's white, but it's not white in reality. It's because it's partially in shadow, or it's um, doesn't have the full amount of light that other parts of the face are getting. Okay, excuse me. I'm going to do a quick measurement again. I'm having a little bit of indigestion because I wolfed down a Clark burger um, before I started this. We had a little cooking. I don't know if it's a cooking mishap, but I have freshly made pesto um, with pasta, and I was going to barbecue some chicken on the grill outdoors. And then when I opened the package of chicken, it smelled off. So I decided to be err on the side of caution and not um, and toss it instead of cook with it. And so then I had to run out to get some burgers. And we have this place near us, Clark Burger. And if anyone um, has a chance to visit Baltimore and wants some of the best burgers, these are the I consider them the best hamburgers in Baltimore, and so I highly recommend them. But yes, I wolfed down a Clark burger and some fries before this, and so if you hear a little bit of slight burping as I'm talking, it's because of that. Sorry. Okay. So I am starting to feel that kind of intensity in the eye. I'm gonna see if I can adjust that ear a little bit. I have the tip of his ear coming up too high. I can see it. His eyebrow is like coming right here. And if I follow the line of his eyebrow, it should hit just the upper tip of his ear. So I need to have this hair come down just a little bit lower. I'm actually using too small a brush for what I'm painting, but I'm still kind of in the drawing stage here, even though I'm full on painting. But I do want to be able to have enough control to lay some of these forms down exactly where I want them. Just like I said again, there's a lot going on in his face. I will clean some of this up with much broader strokes as I go along. Do There's some really strong red in the shadow part of his ear. This is fairly typical. It just is where there's a shadow in the ear, but there's also some light passing through, meaning that the ear is somewhat transparent, and when the light passes through, it's picking up the red your the from the blood that's in your ears. So the light's passing through your blood vessels. Just like if you hold up your hand to the light, it's a similar sort of thing going on there, where you see the webs of your fingers, or where your fingers are held closely together and the light is bouncing around between your fingertips. Then it will pick up the reds from the little bit of skin or webs of your fingers where the light is passing through. Okay, and so I need to cut in just a little bit more with the side of his face. I don't know where that color just came from. Okay, and then some of this edge here, the jawline is extended just a little bit because of his slight shadow or beard. And I'm just going to indicate where some of these highlights are going to come in. Again, I can't get this highlight to read correctly if I don't area around it dark enough. So that, and now I'm finally picking up a bigger brush. That's it's taken me a while to get there, but and I know I'm going too dark there, so that's too dark and too red. Looks like someone just beat him about the face a little bit, so I do have to knock that back, or that is just going to look um, very strange indeed. And get some of the orange color that I'm getting. When I say orange color, I just mean that I'm seeing something that looks warmer or orangey in relationship to the things around it. Okay, and one of the things I know I want in this painting is that quality of the highlights that make him look a little bit sweaty or just slightly wet. Um, and so I have to pay attention to where those highlights, some of them I can only get by maybe scumbling with the brush on top to get sort of the sense of the pores or texture of his skin. And let me see, we have good 11 people tuning in right now. I don't know if it's hard for me to see if you can see the number of people here. I can see it on my phone, and um, so yeah. So and my phone tells me that there's 11 people here. I just so you know, I had been doing this at for the last few weeks, starting at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. That that time was picked somewhat arbitrarily when I started. It was based on the time that I used to go to a painting workshop. I maybe someday I will go back there, but I kind of had that previous time slot in my calendar, so that's when I started doing this. But um, it doesn't give me a whole lot of time to get home from work, get dinner on the table, and do sort of whatever family business needs to be done before starting this, and it has always been a little bit stressful. And so I decided to move it to 9 o'clock, just partially because 9 o'clock doing a 2.5 hour demo, which would get into about 11:30, was fine for most people on the East Coast, but it also meant that some of the people tuning in from Central Time, Mountain Time, or Pacific Time, especially Pacific Time, means that they would be more likely to be able to get home from work and and be able to tune in at least before the demo was completed. So it would be 6 o'clock Eastern, sorry, Pacific Time. So right now I have this brush. It's a flat, but um, the the hairs of it are fraying a little bit, and I'm actually using that to get some, a little more texture in the stroke. I don't know if you're familiar with rosemary brushes, but they have a they have a comb brush. It's the brush is designed to have that little bit of separation. Um, I may be a little bit too cheap. I just wait for the brush to naturally separate like that, and then use that. So that kind of um, striping from the hairs of the brush that are in the brush stroke itself really does help in describing the form. It really forces your eye to follow around contours in the stroke. So if I can use that to make something hyperdimensional, um, it's something that is not present necessarily in the photo. But this was an idea that John Singer Sargent used a lot, was to follow the contours of a form with his brush and create something that was kind of like grooves in a record. Um, these sort of very close parallel lines in the stroke, and maybe there might be two colors that he has mixed into the brush together, and then when he strokes with that brush you can see those two competing colors, or it may just be from alla prima, from him painting one color on top of another color. But in any case, it really both accentuated the brushstroke and also force the viewer's eye around the form in a much more forceful way. And so, in that way, he could create a greater sense of form than even what was apparent visually in in the model or in the reference photo. I mean, he didn't paint from photos necessarily, but if you are working from a photo, then that little bit of texture in the brushstroke really can help you um, get a little bit more mileage out of the stroke, the paint stroke, to help describe the form. So there's lots of things, different things that help create that that sense of volume, of 3D, um, that something's coming actually forward or back out of the panel or canvas. Texture is one of them. The texture I was just talking about is a directional texture, but you can also have texture against areas that are more smooth, and that will um, texture will come forward. That's a real technique that Rembrandt used in a way. He would really exploit that idea because if you look at his paintings, his portraits, he'll have the shadows really drop off and be fairly obscure. And obscure is maybe the right word because it means darkness. It means to be in the dark. But his shadows, what's going on in the shadows is fairly obscure. And then what's going on in the light, he'll put down thicker and thicker passages of paint, and then he'll get very, very thick around the highlights of of the subject, and then he'll also, as that those highlights are somewhat dry, then he would come in kind of with dirty washes into that texture and let that pull up into the crevices of the texture, and then that would create even a greater sense of texture there. So if you have a chance to see a Rembrandt painting in a museum, take a really good close look at the thickness of paint that he's using and how he's almost like pushing the brush straight in and kind of carving in a way with the paint into the form, and then look for those sort of dirty washes that sort of are in all the crevices of the texture, especially in the lighter areas of the face, to really give it kind of a hyper texture and hyper surface quality to really help then um, create that illusion of space. He was a master at that. It's not something that I do enough. I put a little bit of texture down, but it's sort of not my shtick. I like to have the paint look a little bit more fluid, and so I don't tend to do that quite so much. But that was something. But it's something you can think about if you really want to have more of a textural surface in your paintings. That is one direction to go. So I just talked about it. Sargent will have directional textures in his brushstrokes, uh, brushstrokes that come around and they follow the form, and he'll get even thicker and thicker with the paint so that he is creating an even greater sense of texture and form as he does that. And then and that's something a little, I think Sargent picked up a little bit from Velazquez, would have that to some degree, and but Rembrandt, his textures um, aren't directional like that. They're just more spot texture and do not necessarily follow the form. They're more about creating a sense of uh, focus for the eye to pull areas forward. Okay, don't want to belabor that point too much, but it's just something to think about as you're playing with paint textures. And then there's someone like Franz Hall. Franz Hall was someone that John Singer Sargent really, whose work he was also influenced from. And Franz Hall tends to not paint very thick. He just had generally used an even amount of paint across the whole painting. I mean, he would have areas of dark um, that were traditional to portraits of that time. You wanted a fair amount of dark, transparent paint to support little thicker passages of paint in the lights to give a greater sense of light. But overall, he used this kind of short, broken brush strokes. When I say broken, that you can see distinct patterns of rapid, short, squarish brush strokes um, next to each other or on top of each other. And it's the kind of thing, it's an amazing optical illusion because just like Sargent's work and some other masters, is that it will just all look like a mess of brushstrokes as you're when you're just really close up, but then as you move away from the subject, it really those brushstrokes really become um, they just start to weave together, they integrate together, and then what looked like a mess up close, then this becomes the whatever the object was he was painting. If it's like ruffles of, and you have to know that the collars, those ruffled collars that they wore for their portraits back then in Delft and in parts of Holland, um, to show status, those ruffles that had hundreds of little pleats in it. Um, Frans Hals was, and Rembrandt too, was a master painting those. But if you look at Frans Hals, it's a crazy rhythm of little brush strokes to make those, and you can see every stroke just sitting on the surface. There was no blending. There was no, second and third tries. He was just going through. It almost looks like machine gun fire, where he's just painting one brushstroke next to another with a high level of assuredness, and just looks like a crazy rhythm of strokes, and you can't figure out like how is that going to look like anything, and then you step back and it's just perfect. That it looks like light um, that's beating off of that like perfectly starched white collar. You can see the luminosity from the light hitting off of it, and it's just crazy. Just trying to figure out how he did it, because it looks like he just stepped up with a really big brush and just started pounding away. I'm sure in reality he was probably painting and carefully measuring each one of those, almost similar to the way that the J.C. Leindecker painted, which was the series of pattern brushstrokes to create the sense of form. And Leindecker, he was just amazing at doing that, almost in a way to his detriment, because some of what he's painting starts to look um, almost hyper real or kind of plasticky looking, the way every form in the light side of his figures is reflecting light so much. And um, so he may have overplayed that to some degree, but every artist and illustrator who is familiar with his work is is just in awe of how this guy painted. It's just he was he's not known as a fine artist. He's known as an illustrator, but there is a high degree of um, art and style in what he's doing that has such a high level of originality that and then people have been copying it for years and years. He was one of the original great illustrators of the United States, and really carved out his own style, very original, just like Franz Hall's in a way. In that sense, Franz Hall's style is very unique to him and maybe to his students, his school or his workshop of painters, probably painted in a very similar way, which is true with um, a lot of shops or students of particular masters um, will help either create paint directly on the paintings that the master is working on, so they have to learn those techniques, or will learn the techniques to do their own paintings in the style of that master. And it's why a lot of museums also have trouble being able to attribute um, paintings to the portfolio resume of those artists, because they will also have students painting in a very similar style. So then it just comes down to looking at the quality of the painting itself to decide whether it was painted by a Franz Hals or a Rembrandt or um, or a Leonardo da Vinci or a student of one of those artists. So I'm just going along and I'm just kind of painting away at what I see here, given that hopefully that um, my measurements were being close enough, but just in a way putting down, um, I don't know if I want to call it planes of color, because um, there are some artists that paint, they carve out plane by plane the forms, or the facets of the forms. I tend to paint more like rivers or areas of color. I don't know if there's people out there that have um, worked in Photoshop a lot, but there's a filter that's called posterize, which comes from a photographic term, which is similar, which is taking an image and then breaking it or separating it into several areas of discrete color and value. And the way I paint is similar to that, is that I look for similar areas of color and value um, that are together, and I try to paint them in sort of the biggest area as possible. So like this area of black, that's part of of the shadow here of the eyebrow ridge, and then where it actually meets the eyebrow, and then the hair coming down is all almost like one single area of black. And so I'm just, for now, I'm just painting it as just one single shape, and then I can go and add a little more definition later. But that is sort of how I'm thinking about it, is that I'm going ahead and painting those colors and values as much as I can together to get the sense of it. I'm missing a little bit of the shadow here. It's kind of reddish on the far side of the eye. It's throwing my measurements off a little bit, so I want to make sure that I get that in. And also, there's a bit of red, or here I'm painting it kind of violet, and it's a little more violet, that's between the shadow and the light area. And this is often where you'll get a little more hint of color, especially where um, the light is kind of creating areas of gray, but you'll see then transition in color between the shadow and the light side of the forms. I'm going to create a little bit of bluish, a light blue color to kind of start to indicate where he has a little bit of stubble. I'm not going to go ahead and paint stubble itself quite yet. I can get there by that same thing I was talking about the brush where there starts to be a little bit of separation in the hairs of the brush. I can maybe not result not resort to having um, a, a small detail brush to paint every hair. I really don't want to do that. I just want to more try to create a sense of there being hair there, and I can probably do so pretty convincingly by with a bigger brush by getting the textures out of the brush. So that's you can kind of create a sense of realism without getting crazy about copying every little hair, because our brains do a pretty good job of filling in blanks, and also where something is not um, is sort of suggested. That's where our brain will jump in and complete the picture for us. Okay, so uh, I have. Let me see. Biden Crane says, "Has the picture frozen for anyone else? I can hear you speak, but the picture hasn't changed." Okay, so Bryden, if you're coming over from Instagram, if you're watching the video from within Instagram, I found that depending on the operating system of your phone, if you're on a phone, that sometimes the picture will just be stuck in one place, but you can still hear the volume. Oh, I'm just painting really slow. Um, okay, maybe that's true. Um, yeah, the video isn't changing, so that's a lady too. Um, I may have to also check my Wi-Fi because sometimes that doesn't do a good job of that. Um, can I just do a little test? I'm waving my brush in front of the camera, and there's a little bit of delay. And nope, that picture hasn't changed in a little while. So I am going to see if I can go to airplane mode and then snap out of it to see if I can get it to pick up the Wi-Fi again, or get a better signal. Let's see. This will just make me drop out. Okay, and then I go back to here.